April 3, 1946, Springfield, Illinois. Margaret Hayes stood in her kitchen, staring at the envelope in her hands. It was thin, worn at the edges, postmarked from a POW camp in Nebraska. The handwriting was careful, precise, the kind of penmanship that suggested education and effort. But what made her hands shake wasn't the envelope itself. It was the return address. Prisoner, PRA 547821, Camp Atlanta, Nebraska. And below it, a name, Hauptmann Carl Becker. Margaret knew that name. She had heard it exactly once, 14 months earlier, in a telegram from the War Department. The telegram that had informed her that her husband, Captain Thomas Hayes, had been killed in action near Aachen, Germany, shot by German forces during street-to-street fighting in October 1944. She had never learned the details, just that he was dead, that he had died fighting the enemy, that his body had been recovered and buried in a military cemetery in Belgium, and that she was now a widow at 28 years old, with a 4-year-old daughter and a life that had been shattered into pieces she didn't know how to put back together. And now, 16 months after Tom's death, she was holding a letter from a German prisoner of war. A letter that began with 5 words that made her sink into a chair, her vision blurring with tears. I am the man who killed your husband. If stories like this matter to you, listen closely, because this is not a story about forgiveness. It's not about redemption. It's about the moment when everything you thought you understood about grief, about hatred, about the enemy, is turned upside down by a single act of impossible honesty. When the person responsible for the worst thing that ever happened to you reaches out across an ocean, across a war, across everything that makes them your enemy, and says, I need you to know the truth. This is the story of Carl Becker, a German officer who did something that made no sense by any logic of war. He wrote to the widow of the man he killed, not to apologize, not to justify, but to tell her what her husband's last moments had been like, because he believed she deserved to know, and that belief changed both their lives forever. History doesn't repeat itself, but it echoes, and if you listen closely enough, you can still hear the sound of a woman reading a letter in her kitchen in Illinois, learning about her husband's death from the man who caused it, and having to decide whether the enemy who tells the truth is still the enemy at all. Margaret's kitchen smelled of coffee and toast. Her daughter, Annie, was in the living room, playing with wooden blocks, her small voice making up stories for imaginary characters. Outside, it was a gray April morning, the kind that promised rain but hadn't yet delivered. Margaret read the letter slowly, her hands trembling so badly she had to set it on the table to keep the words from blurring. Mrs. Hayes, I am writing to you from a prisoner of war camp in Nebraska. I do not know if this letter will reach you. I do not know if you will read it if it does. But I feel I must write it anyway, because what I have to tell you cannot remain unspoken. My name is Carl Becker. I was a captain in the Wehrmacht, 3rd Panzergrenadier Division. On October 15, 1944, my unit was defending a position in Aachen, Germany, when American forces launched an assault on our sector. Your husband, Captain Thomas Hayes, was leading one of those assaults. The fighting was brutal, house to house, room to room, the kind of fighting where you see your enemy's face before you kill him, where there is no distance, no abstraction, just 2 men trying to survive. I killed your husband. I shot him during the fighting. He was advancing through a building my men were defending. He came around a corner. I fired. He fell. I am telling you this not to justify what I did, not to explain it away as the necessities of war. I killed your husband. That is the truth, and you deserve to know it. Margaret stopped reading. Her vision was swimming. Her chest felt tight like she couldn't get enough air. She wanted to tear up the letter, to throw it away, to pretend she had never received it. Because knowing was worse than not knowing. Knowing meant having to think about Tom's last moments. Knowing meant having a face, a name, a person to attach to her grief. But she kept reading. Because something in the letter's honesty compelled her. Something in the way Carl wrote, direct, unflinching, devoid of excuses, made her need to know what came next. But I'm writing to tell you something else. Something I think you need to hear. Your husband was brave. In the moments before he died, he saw me. He could have retreated. He could have taken cover. But he was covering his men, drawing fire so they could advance. He knew he was exposed. He chose it anyway. That is the kind of man your husband was. Not a number in a casualty report, not an abstraction, but a man who made a choice to protect others at the cost of his own safety. I am a prisoner now. The war is over. Germany lost. I lost. But I have not lost my memory. And I cannot forget your husband's face, the way he looked in those final seconds, not with fear, not with hatred, but with determination, with purpose. I do not ask for your forgiveness. I do not deserve it. I only ask that you know your husband died as a soldier, as a brave man, as someone who made a choice that mattered. I am sorry for your loss. I know those words are inadequate, but they are all I have. Hauptmann Karl Becker, prisoner, 471, Swan, Camp Atlanta, Nebraska. Margaret finished the letter and sat in silence for a long time. Annie's voice drifted in from the living room, talking to her blocks. The clock on the wall ticked. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall. And Margaret felt something she hadn't expected. Not anger, not hatred, but confusion. Because the letter had humanized the man who killed her husband, had turned him from a faceless enemy into a person who remembered, who felt responsible, who thought Tom's widow deserved to know the truth, and she didn't know what to do with that. They expected silence. They expected that German prisoners held in American camps would stay quiet, would serve their time, return home, and never speak of what they had done during the war. Because speaking meant confronting guilt, meant acknowledging their role in a war that had killed millions, meant admitting they were the enemy. But Karl Becker had broken that silence. Not because he wanted absolution, not because he thought a letter could undo what he had done, but because he believed Margaret had a right to know that the truth, no matter how painful, was better than ignorance. In the weeks after receiving the letter, Margaret couldn't stop thinking about it. She read it over and over, looking for some hint of manipulation, some hidden agenda. Was Karl trying to ease his own guilt? Was he seeking forgiveness? Was he trying to make himself feel better by painting Tom as a hero? But the more she read it, the more she believed it was simply what it claimed to be. The truth. Unvarnished. Uncomfortable. But honest. She showed the letter to her father, a veteran of World War I who lived 2 streets away. He read it in silence, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the paper so hard it crumpled at the edges. When he finished, he handed it back to her and said, "Burn it." "What?" "Burn it, Margaret. You don't need this. You don't need to know how Tom died. You don't need to humanize the man who killed him. That German is trying to make you feel sorry for him. Don't let him." "I don't think that's what he's doing," Margaret said quietly. "Then what is he doing?" I think he's telling me the truth, and I think he thinks I deserve to know it." Her father shook his head. "The enemy doesn't care about what you deserve. He's playing you." But Margaret wasn't so sure, because there was something in the letter's tone, something raw and honest, that didn't feel like manipulation. It felt like confession, like a man unburdening himself of a weight he couldn't carry alone. She thought about the War Department telegram, the cold official language, killed in action. No details, no context, just a notification that her husband was dead and that his body had been recovered. She had spent 14 months imagining how Tom died. Had he suffered? Had he been alone? Had he been afraid? The not knowing had been torture, a constant loop of worst-case scenarios playing in her mind. But Karl's letter had given her something, specificity. Tom had been covering his men. He had been brave. He had made a choice. It didn't erase the pain, but it gave the pain shape, made it something she could understand instead of something that haunted her in the abstract. And yet accepting that truth meant accepting that it came from the enemy, from the man who had pulled the trigger, from someone she was supposed to hate. Margaret went to see Tom's mother, Elizabeth Hayes, a stern woman who had never approved of Margaret, had thought Tom married too young, to the wrong woman. But grief had softened her, made her more human. She was the only person Margaret knew who might understand what she was feeling. Elizabeth read the letter. Then she folded it carefully and said, "What are you going to do?" "I don't know." "Are you going to write back?" Margaret hadn't even considered it. "Should I?" Elizabeth was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "My son is dead. Nothing will bring him back. Not hatred, not vengeance, not silence. If this German is telling the truth, if Tom really died the way he says, then maybe we owe it to Tom to acknowledge it, to say, 'Thank you for telling us.'" "Thank you?" Margaret's voice was sharp. "He killed Tom." "Yes," Elizabeth said, "and he's living with that. And he thought we should know the truth. That takes courage. Not as much courage as Tom had, but courage nonetheless." For 3 weeks Margaret debated whether to respond. She wrote drafts and tore them up. She started letters and couldn't finish them. Because what do you say to the man who killed your husband? How do you find words for something that shouldn't exist? A conversation between widow and killer, enemy and survivor, victim and perpetrator. Finally, on April 28th, she wrote a single page, direct, honest, mirroring Carl's tone. "Captain Becker, I received your letter. I don't know why you wrote it. I don't know what you expected. But I want you to know that I read it, and I believe you. I believe that my husband was brave. I believe that he died protecting his men. I believe that you remember his face. I don't forgive you. I don't think I can. But I don't hate you either. Because hatred requires certainty. It requires seeing the enemy as a monster, and your letter made you human, and I don't know how to hate someone who had the courage to tell me the truth when lying would have been easier. My daughter is 4 years old. She doesn't remember her father. All she knows is that he went away and didn't come back. Someday she will ask me how he died, and I will tell her what you told me. That he was brave. That he made a choice. That he died protecting others. I don't know if that will be enough for her. But it's more than I had before your letter. I hope you find peace. I hope you go home and build a life that honors the memory of the men you fought against, not by forgetting them, but by living in a way that makes their deaths mean something. Margaret Hayes. She mailed the letter before she could change her mind, and then she waited, not knowing if it would reach him, not knowing if he would respond, not knowing if she even wanted him to. 6 weeks later, another letter arrived, thinner than the first, just 2 pages. "Mrs. Hayes, I did not expect a response. I did not deserve one, but I am grateful. You asked why I wrote to you. The truth is, I don't fully know. After I was captured, after the fighting stopped, I had time to think, time to remember, time to confront what I had done. I killed 23 men during the war. I know because I counted. Your husband was the 17th. I remember each of their faces. I see them when I close my eyes. I hear them in the silence of the barracks at night. But your husband was different because of the choice he made, because of the way he died. I have killed cowards. I have killed men who begged. I have killed men who ran. But your husband faced me. And even knowing he was exposed, even knowing he might die, he held his position so his men could advance. That haunted me, because it meant his death wasn't random. It wasn't chance. It was a choice. He chose to die so others could live, and I was the instrument of that choice. I wrote to you because I thought you should know that his death mattered. Not in the abstract way that all soldiers' deaths are supposed to matter, but in a specific, tangible way. His men survived that assault because of him. I know because I watched them advance after he fell. They took the position. They won. Your husband won. Even in death. I cannot give you back your husband. I cannot undo what I did. But I can give you this, the knowledge that he did not die for nothing, that his sacrifice was real, that somewhere in America there are men who went home to their families because your husband gave them the seconds they needed to survive. I am being repatriated next month. I will return to Germany, to a country I no longer recognize, to a family I haven't seen in 5 years. I don't know what kind of life awaits me there. But I know I will carry your husband's memory with me, not as a burden, but as a reminder that even in war, even in the worst of humanity, there are moments of grace, moments when someone chooses honor over survival, when someone becomes more than a soldier and becomes a symbol of everything good that war tries to destroy. Thank you for responding. Thank you for not hating me. Thank you for giving me permission to remember your husband not just as the man I killed, but as the man he was. With respect, Carl Becker. Margaret read the letter 3 times. Then she went to Tom's photograph on the mantel, the one taken before he shipped out in his dress uniform, smiling at the camera like he didn't have a care in the world. And she said out loud, for the first time since his death, "I'm proud of you." The correspondence between Margaret Hayes and Carl Becker was not unique. After World War II, dozens, perhaps hundreds, of similar exchanges occurred. Enemy soldiers reaching out to the families of men they had killed, widows writing to prisoners, parents seeking closure from the men who had taken their sons. Most of these exchanges were private, never publicized, kept as personal artifacts of grief and reconciliation that families didn't know how to share with a world that demanded clear lines between hero and villain, victim and perpetrator. But in 1952, Margaret made a decision that would change her life. She published excerpts of the letters in a local newspaper, along with an essay about what the correspondence had meant to her. The response was immediate and explosive. Some praised her, called her brave, said she was modeling a new kind of peace, one built on truth and mutual recognition of humanity. But others condemned her, called her a traitor, accused her of dishonoring Tom's memory by corresponding with his killer, said she was spitting on the graves of American soldiers. One veteran wrote, "My brother died in Germany fighting men like Carl Becker. How dare you humanize the enemy? How dare you give comfort to a Nazi?" But Margaret responded publicly, "Carl Becker is not a Nazi. He was a soldier who followed orders just like my husband, and when the war ended he did something extraordinary. He told the truth. He gave me closure. He gave my daughter a story about her father that she can be proud of. And yes, he's a human being. That doesn't excuse what he did. But it also doesn't mean we should pretend he's a monster, because if we can't see our enemies as human, then we're destined to keep creating new enemies." The controversy attracted the attention of a journalist named Robert Mitchell, who was writing a book about post-war reconciliation. He tracked down Carl Becker in Germany and interviewed him. Carl had returned to his hometown of Heidelberg, a city that had been relatively spared from bombing. He had found his family alive, his wife, his 2 daughters, his elderly mother. He had returned to his pre-war profession as a civil engineer and was helping rebuild German infrastructure. But he carried the war with him. In the interview he said, "I have 2 lives, the life before I wrote to Mrs. Hayes, and the life after. Before, I was drowning in guilt. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't look at my daughters without seeing the faces of the men I killed. I was alive, but I wasn't living. Writing that letter, telling the truth, it didn't absolve me. But it gave me a purpose. It reminded me that the men I killed were human, that they had families, that their lives mattered, and that if I was going to honor their memory, I needed to live a life worthy of the second chance I had been given." Mitchell asked, "Do you regret writing to Mrs. Hayes?" Carl shook his head. "Never. It was the bravest thing I've ever done. Braver than anything I did in the war. Because in war, you just follow orders. But writing that letter? That was a choice to face what I had done, to take responsibility, to tell the truth even when it would have been easier to stay silent. The book, published in 1955, included the full correspondence between Margaret and Carl. It became a bestseller, and it sparked a movement, a small but growing group of people who believed that post-war reconciliation required more than treaties and reparations. It required truth. It required acknowledgement. It required seeing the enemy as human. Margaret and Carl never met in person, but they continued to correspond for the next 30 years. The letters became less about the war and more about life. Carl would write about his daughters. Margaret would write about Annie. They exchanged photographs. They shared milestones, graduations, weddings, grandchildren. And slowly, over decades, something impossible happened. They became friends, not in spite of what had happened, but because of it, because they had chosen honesty over hatred, truth over comfortable lies, humanity over the categories that war demands. They called it reconciliation, but that word felt too small for what had happened between Margaret and Carl. Because reconciliation implies that something broken has been fixed, that wounds have been healed, that the past has been resolved. But the past wasn't resolved. Tom was still dead. Carl had still killed him. The war had still happened. Nothing had been fixed. What had happened was something else, something stranger, something that most people couldn't understand. They had created a relationship built on the acknowledgement of irreparable harm, a relationship that didn't deny the past or excuse it, but existed alongside it, a relationship that said, "You hurt me in a way that can never be undone, and I see you, and you are human." The irony was profound. Carl Becker, a German officer who had fought for a regime that represented everything evil, had become one of the most important people in Margaret's life. Not because she forgave him, but because he had given her something no one else could, the truth about Tom's death. And that truth, painful as it was, had set her free from the endless loop of imagining, wondering, torturing herself with possibilities. In 1968, Margaret's daughter Annie, now 26, married, with a son of her own, asked her mother a question that had been building for years. "Mom, why do you keep writing to the man who killed Dad?" Margaret thought for a long time. Then she said, "Because he's the only person in the world who can tell me about your father's last moments. Not the War Department, not his fellow soldiers, but Carl. He was there, he saw, and he chose to share that with me when he didn't have to. That's a gift, a terrible, painful gift, but a gift nonetheless." "But doesn't it hurt? Every time you write to him, doesn't it remind you?" "Yes," Margaret said, "it hurts. Every time. But the hurt is different now. It's not the hurt of not knowing. It's the hurt of knowing, and knowing is better, even when it's worse." Carl, in his letters, expressed a similar paradox. In 1970 he wrote, "I have lived with guilt for 26 years. I thought at first that the guilt would fade. That time would make it easier, but it hasn't. If anything, it has become sharper. Because the older I get, the more I understand what I took from you. From Annie, from Tom's mother. I took a husband, a father, a son, and no amount of time erases that. But your letters, our correspondence, has given the guilt meaning. It has reminded me that Tom's death was not random, that he mattered, that his sacrifice had purpose, and that if I am going to live with what I did, I must live in a way that honors him, not by forgetting, but by remembering, and by trying to be the kind of man he was, brave, selfless, willing to sacrifice for others." In 1975, 30 years after Tom's death, Margaret traveled to Germany. It was her first time leaving the United States. She went with Annie and Annie's son, David, and she went to meet Carl Becker. They met in a cafe in Heidelberg. Margaret was 57. Carl was 63. They had been writing to each other for 29 years, but this was the first time they had seen each other's faces. Margaret described the moment later. "I don't know what I expected. Maybe that I would feel anger or resentment or pain, but when I saw him, this elderly man with gray hair and kind eyes, I just felt relief. Relief that he was real, that he wasn't a monster, that the person I had been writing to for 3 decades was exactly who he claimed to be. They talked for hours. About Tom, about the war, about their children and grandchildren, about the lives they had built from the ruins of the lives they had lost. At the end of the day, Margaret said something that shocked her own daughter. "Thank you for writing that first letter, for telling me the truth, for giving me closure." And Carl, tears streaming down his face, said, "Thank you for responding, for seeing me as human, for not hating me when you had every right to." They never saw each other again. Carl died in 1982. Margaret died in 1995. But the letters continued, passed down to their children, a record of something that shouldn't have been possible. A friendship born from tragedy, a connection forged in honesty. When Margaret Hayes died in 1995, at the age of 77, she left behind a box, a small wooden box that she had kept in her closet for 50 years. Inside were the letters, every single one. Over 300 pages of correspondence between a widow and the man who had killed her husband. Annie, now 53, read through them in the weeks after her mother's death. She had read excerpts over the years, but never the full collection. And what she found surprised her. The letters weren't just about Tom. They were about life, about hope, about the possibility of moving forward without forgetting, about building something new from the ruins of something destroyed. In one letter from 1963, Margaret had written, "People ask me how I can write to you, how I can stay in contact with the man who killed my husband. And I tell them, because hatred is easy. Hatred requires no thought, no effort, no growth, but understanding, really understanding your enemy, really seeing them as human, that's hard. That requires courage." And Tom was brave. So I try to be brave too. In a letter from 1978, Carl had written, "I think often about what my life would have been if I had not written that first letter. I think I would have died years ago, not physically but spiritually. The guilt would have consumed me. But your willingness to see me as human, to acknowledge what I did without defining me entirely by it, gave me permission to live. Not to forget, but to live. And that is a gift I can never repay." Annie decided to publish the letters. Not all of them, but enough to tell the story. She worked with a historian to contextualize them, to explain the era, to help readers understand why these two people, who should have been enemies forever, had chosen a different path. The book was published in 1998. It was titled Letters Across the Line, A Widow, a Soldier, and the Truth That Changed Everything. It became a bestseller. Schools used it in history classes. Peace organizations referenced it. Survivors of other conflicts, Vietnam, Korea, Iraq, reached out to say that the book had helped them process their own grief, their own complicated relationships with former enemies. One reviewer wrote, "This is not a story about forgiveness. Forgiveness implies that what happened can be undone, that the harm can be erased." But Margaret Hayes never forgave Carl Becker for killing her husband. Instead, she did something harder. She saw him as human. She acknowledged the truth of what he had done, and she chose to build a relationship based on that truth rather than on the comfortable lie that enemies are monsters. David, Margaret's grandson, wrote the foreword to the book. He had been 10 years old when he met Carl Becker in Heidelberg. He remembered the old man crying as he talked about Tom, about the war, about the weight he had carried for 30 years. In the foreword, David wrote, "My grandmother taught me something that schools don't teach. She taught me that the world is not divided into good people and bad people. It's divided into people who face the truth and people who run from it. Carl Becker faced the truth. He told my grandmother what he had done. He took responsibility. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He just told the truth. And my grandmother, in return, chose to see him as human, not to excuse him, but to acknowledge him. And in that acknowledgement, they both found something they desperately needed: meaning, purpose, a reason to keep living when grief and guilt would have been easier ways to die." He left as the enemy and became the guardian of a truth that set them both free. There is a lesson here, a lesson about the difference between forgiveness and acknowledgement. We are taught that forgiveness is the highest virtue, that we should forgive those who wrong us, that holding on to anger and hatred only hurts us, that letting go is the path to healing. But Margaret Hayes didn't forgive Carl Becker. She said so explicitly multiple times in letters and interviews. She never said, "I forgive you for killing my husband." Because some things are unforgivable. Some wounds don't heal. Some losses can't be made whole. What Margaret did was something else, something harder. She acknowledged Carl as human. She saw him not just as the man who killed Tom, but as a man who was living with that choice, who was trying to make sense of it, who believed she deserved the truth. And that acknowledgement, that willingness to see the enemy as human without excusing what they did, created a space for something new. Not forgiveness, but understanding, connection, the recognition that even in the worst moments of human history, even in the most violent acts, there are people. Complex, flawed, broken people. And if we can see that complexity, if we can hold on to it, we might be able to prevent the next war, the next atrocity, the next cycle of dehumanization and violence. History doesn't repeat itself. It waits for those who forget to listen. And right now, in a world where we are constantly told to choose sides, to see people as either allies or enemies, to reduce human beings to categories and labels, the story of Margaret and Carl matters more than ever, because it reminds us that truth is more important than comfort, that honesty is more valuable than easy hatred, that seeing the enemy as human doesn't mean excusing what they did. It means taking responsibility for what we do next. Carl Becker killed Thomas Hayes. That is true. Nothing changes that. No letter, no correspondence, no friendship. Tom is still dead. Margaret still lost her husband. Annie still grew up without a father. But Carl also told the truth. He gave Margaret closure. He honored Tom's memory by acknowledging his courage. He lived the rest of his life trying to be worthy of the second chance he had been given, and Margaret chose to acknowledge that, to see it, to let it complicate her grief without erasing it. That choice, that impossible, brave human choice, is what makes this story matter. The guard never sleeps, because the moment we stop seeing our enemies as human, the moment we reduce them to monsters or abstractions, we make the next war inevitable. We make the next cycle of violence certain. We become incapable of peace, because peace requires us to sit across from the people who hurt us and see them, really see them, not to forgive, but to acknowledge. Margaret Hayes did that. Carl Becker did that. And because they did, the world became a little bit better. Not healed, not fixed, but better. And maybe that's all we can ever hope for. That in the middle of grief and guilt and all the things that war leaves behind, someone has the courage to tell the truth, and someone else has the courage to hear it, and together they build something that shouldn't be possible, a connection that transcends hate. That's the legacy of Margaret Hayes and Carl Becker. Not that they forgave, but that they acknowledged, and that acknowledgement changed everything. There are more stories like this one. Stories of impossible connections, of people who chose truth over comfort, humanity over hatred, acknowledgement over forgiveness. If this matters to you, if you believe that peace requires more than treaties, that it requires the courage to see our enemies as human, subscribe to Warden of War. The archive opens every week, and every story is a reminder that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means remembering honestly. Which story should we open next? Tell us in the comments, and let us know. Have you ever experienced a moment where an enemy, or someone who hurt you, told you the truth? How did it change you? How did it change the way you saw them? Share your story. Share this with someone who's struggling with grief, with anger, with the inability to forgive. Because Margaret Hayes teaches us that you don't have to forgive to move forward. You just have to be willing to see, to acknowledge, to hold the truth, even when it hurts.